I am Commander B.J. Armstrong, a permanent military professor here at the Naval Academy and a former search and rescue helicopter pilot. I teach classes on American naval history and on the history of 20th century naval strategy and thought. Privateering was a part of naval warfare that dated back centuries. A privateer is a private individual or privately owned ship that engages as a part of a naval war under a commission provided by their government. Now, usually, privateers are associated with commerce warfare, which is a key element of any successful naval strategy. Because the world's oceans are the great superhighway of trade and commerce, cutting off your enemy from their use can have a significant effect on their ability to fight a war with you. And throughout history, this usually came in two forms: blockading an enemy's ports, or attacking their merchant and supply ships on the high seas. But patrolling the world's oceans takes a lot of ships. Even just patrolling the entirety of the Atlantic is a daunting task. And the expense of building that many warships was both far beyond what most nations were capable of, but also it was largely unnecessary if you could commission privateers during a conflict. In essence, when war was declared by a government, you could deputize privately owned ships to arm themselves and head out and attack the enemy's trade and supply routes. This cost the government almost nothing, really just the price of the piece of paper that the commission was printed on. Now, it took three things to be a legal privateer. First, it had to be a time of war. Privateering was only legal and recognized during a declared war. Second, you had to have a commission from your government, which was also often known as a letter of marque. This privateering commission was, in essence, your license to prey on the enemy, and it set out the rules that you had to follow. And finally, once you had captured an enemy ship, you had to bring that ship to an admiralty court for adjudication. In this hearing, a judge would review your documentation and the story of the capture, and anything that the ship's owners wanted to offer in evidence to claim that you shouldn't have captured them. Then, he would decide if you had made a legal capture. Now, if it was ruled as a legitimate prize, in most cases, the court would then sell the ship and the cargo and release the crew to return home. And from the sales, they'd take a percentage as a tax to fund the operations of the court. And sometimes the government would take a percentage of taxes, and the remainder would be turned over to the owners of the privateer. The proceeds were then distributed based on the terms of the contract with the captain of the ship and the crew, and everyone received a set percentage. Now, some people refer to privateers as a kind of piracy, but that's not accurate. Privateers had a legal regime that they had to follow, and in many countries they could be held to the similar rules and regulations as the men and officers on a sovereign warship. If a privateer was following the rules, they were definitely not pirates. However, if they broke the rules, that was different. Say they attacked a ship from a country they were not at war with, or they skipped taking their prize to admiralty court, instead selling it themselves, or smuggling the cargo into the black market. Then they had left their legitimate activities behind and had turned pirate. In the American Revolution, at the start of the rebellion, the US didn't have a navy. And while the Continental Congress formed and began building the Continental Navy, they also turned to privateering to reinforce American naval forces. The Congress issued around 1,800 commissions in the Revolution, and those ships captured somewhere between 600 and 2,000 prizes during the war. But it wasn't just the captures that mattered. They also drove up insurance rates, and they raised the cost of goods for the average consumer in Britain. When your tea and the sugar you put in it and your new clothes keep getting more expensive, you start to think about the benefits and the costs of the war you're fighting halfway around the world. By the time the United States returned to fight Great Britain a second time in the War of 1812, privateers were again a big part of how the Americans stood up to the greatest naval power in the world. But in the middle of the 19th century, most of the rest of the world outlawed privateering when they signed the Paris Declaration in 1856. But the United States never ratified that treaty, in part because Americans saw privateering as a key element of their naval power. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, when the negotiations on the laws of war started at The Hague, that the United States largely acquiesced to the rest of the world and formally took privateering out of its naval toolkit. Wars on trade and commerce raiding continued as important parts of naval warfare in the 20th century. But with the development of submarines and the German innovation of unrestricted submarine warfare, its character changed, and privateers were largely left to the history books.